The opponents of the war in Vietnam engage most frequently in criticisms of it, which tend to stress the great cost of that war in human life, American and Vietnamese, in treasuries depleted, in civil antagonisms exacerbated, in war crimes allegedly committed. These aspects of the Vietnam War we have dealt with systematically on the firing line over the endless years since the war began. And the idea today is to converse about the implications of the anti-Vietnam attitude on the general problems of international order, particularly insofar as these raise the question of outstanding American commitments. Mr. John Kerry is a very well-known opponent of the Vietnam War, having made a spectacular entry into the theater of protest when he testified last spring before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He appeared there as a representative of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, whose mass encampment in Washington, D.C. he was engaged in directing. Mr. Kerry, whose book, The New Soldier, is just out, had served several months in Vietnam as a reluctant officer who, however, was decorated for bravery. He had graduated from Yale University in 1966, where as Class A orator, he had confessed his misgivings about Vietnam. He was born in 1944, spent childhood years in France and Germany, attended St. Paul's School, and served as president at Yale of the political union and as a star member of the varsity debating team. He is, as you will note, from Boston. He set out to run for Congress in 1970, but yielded finally to Father Robert Drinan, who was elected on a day when, it has been suggested, God was out to lunch. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Kerry whether, in principle, he believes in the concept of the Mutual Defense Treaty.
Well, it depends on which mutual defense treaty you're talking about. If you're referring
Well, that's
to
what's the concept.
the concept overall, yes, where it applies to very, very real threats. I think the problem with defense treaties at this particular moment, be it CETO or the Baghdad Pact, CENTO, whatever it is that their applicability has lost pertinence to the particular problems that we face in the world today, particularly the nature of what has been popularly called third world movements and other such things. And I think that if you look at the situation in Vietnam, it is more clear than ever, and in point of fact, you could go back and question the very reasons behind the CETO Treaty and how John Foster Dulles and others were responsible for it and why. But the question is the concept, and basically I would say yes, providing the threat is well defined, and I don't see that that has been the case in Vietnam.
Uh-huh. Well, now, would you take the position that the size of the country involved is not necessarily the determining feature that justifies a treaty? That is to say, could you conceive under certain circumstances where one might have a treaty, let's say, with Bermuda?
I could conceive of the situation very really, yes, in so much as Bermuda perhaps, although I'm not saying it does, but if it possibly could represent to us something very real to the integrity of ourselves as a nation, to our future, to our definition of ourselves within the world. And
integrity defined morally or strategically?
Both.
Uh-huh.
Both.
Well, what about defined either way? Suppose it was just a moral integrity.
Well, I don't think that the United States, and I think this is the biggest problem about Vietnam, can necessarily apply moralisms to its commitments around the world. And I think this is one of the great fallacies of our foreign policy at the present moment. Interventionism as well as globalism both stem from the same kind of moralism. And in a certain sense, I think that moralism can be very defeating for the United States and its undertakings. It gets us into a sort of messianic enterprise whereby we have this impression that somehow we can go out and touch these other countries and change them. And I think this is what, in a sense, led us into Vietnam, an extension of what we did to react to the Soviet Union in Europe, what we have done to react to this threat of communism around the world. And we have this moralism which has been applied to all of our efforts since the founding of the United States, which is now interspersed in every single policy and effort that we make. And I think that as a result, it's coming back to haunt us, because it haunts us at home, in so much as there are many areas that we have very really been unable to apply that moralism here, where equality of opportunity and many other things are concerned, as well as abroad, where we have found, especially in Vietnam, that we have not been able to apply these changes quite as quickly or as sweepingly as we thought.
Correct. Now, there are two kinds of moralisms, of course. One is a sort of abstract moralism. One, let's say, says to the people of Bermuda, I promise to defend you because we consider it a fraternal thing to do. And we share the same globe, and we make this commitment. Then there's the other a kind of moralism which says we promise to defend you because we understand you to be strategically implicated in a defense link. Now, under certain circumstances, it might be a threat to Bermuda, which in fact does not excite that link that we were excited about in the first instance, we were worried about in the first instance. But we are afraid, in the hypothetical situation, of not defending Bermuda because to default unilaterally on that particular treaty might cause a lot of people to lose faith in the other outstanding treaties.
I can see exactly.
That has a moral...
Certainly, I see exactly where you're leading, which is probably in the next step to apply it to the situation in Vietnam in so much as a commitment had been made.
In due course.
And that is where we're going.
Don't hurry me.
I won't hurry you. I'll just get there right away. I think that the moralism, and this is what I'm talking about, has been misapplied in so much as it is a situation in Vietnam, and that there are two levels of morality.
Okay.
One,
yeah, but
let me try and finish this now.
Okay. You're talking about levels of morality, or are you talking about Vietnam now?
I'm talking about Vietnam as it pertains to morality, because the Vietnam and morality are very, very, very closely intertwined to what this nation has become. And what I am saying is that we have, in a sense, overused the morality of commitment and stressed, or rather overused that morality of commitment as it has allowed us to obscure the morality of lives being lost, of weapons being used, of the goals of that particular policy. And I think that that is a terrible situation when that happens, because you get a nation like the United States, which has the most incredible technological power that we have, which has in fact turned around and unleashed that power on a nation of thatched huts, of peasants, of mud paths, and everything else, so that you can get the remarkable disparity of tonnages of bombs dropped versus casualty figures.
You're simply talking about the balance of moral questions, but before we do that, I'm perfectly prepared to do that, but I would genuinely like to explore your thinking about that other matter. You get a situation, let's say, in civil life, in which, let's say, a banker makes a commitment to you to lend you such and such a sum of money. When you actually call on him to do so, he finds that it was an unwise commitment, but very often he feels that he has to do that, not so much because he's morally obliged to you, though that could enter into it, but because his failure to do so deprives him of that credibility on the basis of which the
any moment that he had to, his greatest morality would come into effect in so much as he had allegiance to that bank. And in so much as he has allegiance to the bank, he would forget the customer at the drop of a finger. In the same sense, the greatest morality of this country is the allegiance to its people and to us as a nation and to all that we stand for morally. And in so much as that has now come into question, I think that we must apply that to Vietnam.
If I may say so,
you're using the customer, so to speak.
If I may say so, I think you're using the term moral in a vulgar sense. I don't mean in a discreditable sense, but in a vulgar sense, in terms of the relations between nations. Because, for instance, when England said that to Nazi Germany that they could not take over Poland, and Nazi Germany proceeded to do so, there were those who were saying, we do not want to die for Danzig, which was a perfectly straightforward and perfectly understandable
but there's a great
individual moral
difference,
judgment.
I think there's a great difference, Mr. Buckley, in that what happened with England and the successive capitulations of Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc., and the Rhineland, I think those were the direct results. Well, the Rhineland is not really analogous to the situation of the other two, but I think they represent a certain secession of that morality, whereas in a place like Vietnam, the proximity to us as a nation, the very real threats and everything are not the same. When you start talking about Munich and Chamberlain, what happened in Germany and try and apply it to the situation in Southeast Asia, I think you're talking about two situations which are simply not similar. And I think you cannot say that we must draw a line because of our commitment in Vietnam in order to prevent the possibility of Vietnam becoming another Munich. I don't think that's a real comparison at all.
Actually, that's a strategic judgment. Which,
well, it's more than a strategic judgment.
It could be easily faced by my saying that it took much longer in 1939 for an airplane to fly between London and Warsaw than it does for an intercontinental missile to fly from Saigon to here.
But that's irrelevant.
No, well...
It is totally irrelevant to the question of whether or not lives are being lost and for what reason they're being lost.
You brought up the term proximity, which is a strategical... observation, which I think is...
Well, then perhaps, apart from the metaphysics and everything, perhaps you can define to me, in terms of geography, now let's get down to geography, you can define to me what the threat is to the United States in Vietnam, because that, in the last analysis, is why we're still there.
No, I will in due course, but before that, I want to explore the theoretical groundwork.
But isn't that really I mean, theory can apply to a lot of different situations, Mr. Buckley. You and I know very well that you can be consistent and be wrong. And consistency in foreign policy has a tendency, I think, to lead one into very dangerous corners. And I think what Mr. Nixon is trying to prove by his trip to China is that we shouldn't be consistent, and he's made a very brave and bold step by going there. Well, that denies that. So what I'm saying is we have to consider Vietnam.
Because it was so risky politically?
It was
is that why it's so
and
brave and bold?
No, I
is that why his ratings went down in Gallup poll?
Well,
they went up 15 points after his brave and bold gesture to China. But let's really stick on the tracks, because the point I'm trying to wrestle with is this. A lot of people conclude that we shouldn't have gone into Vietnam. But among those, there are some people who are asking themselves the question, was there an alternative under the circumstances? Now, there is the existential alternative. You can simply refuse to give the order. But then they ask themselves the question, suppose we had refused to give the order, what kind of chaos might then have ensued? What would be the net meaning, for instance, of the commitment we have outstanding to Israel, or the commitment we have outstanding to England?
I understand exactly what you're leading at.
Well, then talk about it.
I will talk about it, and I have been. I have talked very, very strongly about
you keep talking about
thatched huts. Well, thatched huts, Mr. Buckley, are very, very important to me.
Well,
I'm sorry, I understand.
Well, to you, but not to this line of discussion, because it had nothing to do with thatched huts.
On the contrary,
suppose there was skyscrapers there, how would that change?
It wouldn't change.
Then why
Skyscrapers
being
and
thatched
huts are the same. They change in terms of relative mobility. In other words, in Germany, we went against a country which was able, in a sense, to resist us because they had radars and equal guns and airplanes in the air, the Luftwaffe, which was shooting down our airplanes.
North Vietnam resisted us much better than Nazi Germany.
No, basically it hasn't, because never has that kind of energy, except bombing, been applied. And the lesson of World War II of bombing was that all it does is strengthen people. Witness London.
But let me come back.
Let me come back.
I mean, if we take the word for Albert Speer, we damn near won the war by bombing.
Well, let me come back to the other thing. That is the question of this morality. Israel, I tried to lead off by talking about very real threats.
Yeah.
Israel, I see as something in this country which is very real. And I see it as something where we can have an effect. I see it as a place where, because of the nature of the government there, because of the history, because of the ties to this nation, religious, ethnic, otherwise, there is a very real something which the United States can affect by continuing to provide arms so that it does affect the balance of power. But in Vietnam, none of those things are true. What we have done in Vietnam, I think, is try and place this great technology of ours in a country that was undergoing an incredible civil strife.
All you're telling me is you don't like the way things worked out.
No, I'm not telling you
whether
that,
you like the way
Mr.
things
Buckley.
worked
I'm
out.
telling you that there's an alternative to what we are doing now. A very real alternative. And that alternative...
Give me the structure of that alternative. Don't give it to me ad hoc as regards
that
Vietnam.
Well, I haven't had a chance to yet. I'm trying to lead there. The structure of the alternative in Vietnam, as far as I am concerned, is to state adamantly on the part of the United States that we have made our commitment in Vietnam, that we have lost a great deal of life, that it was based on certain perceptions of the world and where threats existed to us, which now have changed. And that we have made that commitment, that President Tew, if you want to call it, as Governor Reagan did, an election likened to that of George Washington, a one-man election in our country, you can do that. I don't liken it to that. But the point is, it's done. The point is, it's done.
Well, now, therefore, but would you
What
apply
I'm
it to
saying
other
is
members?
we must
Is
now
it just
set
Vietnam?
a date. No, it's not
Is this
just
a bill of attainder
Vietnam.
against
It applies
Vietnam?
to Laos, it applies to Cambodia, and it applies
Well, of
to
course,
Thailand,
we
and
don't
to our
have any
entire
commitment to
commitment
Laos,
there.
as you know.
Well, we're fighting a war there, a very real war, Mr. Buckley. We've been bombing that country since
Don't tell me it's a
1964.
real war. I know it's a real war. But I'm saying, do we pull out of Vietnam
Wait,
because
let me
of the
ask you
experience
something.
there, or do we pull out of SEATO?
What do you mean you know it's a real war? I mean, tell me seriously, what does that mean, you know it's a real war?
Oh, come on.
No, I'm very serious. What does that mean?
Well, yeah,
It's a very flip statement, but I want to know what it
doesn't mean
means.
anything. What I meant to do was to spare you the necessity of describing the war.
Don't you think perhaps this country needs a few more descriptions of what it's doing over there?
No.
You don't?
Well, certainly not this program, because we've done an awful lot of it. But what we do need to understand is the theoretical and factual implications of following such conduct as you urge on us. Now, you say, repeal such obligations as we have.
I'm going to let you off for a moment, but I'm going to come back to that.
Sure.
But I will continue on the other thing.
Sure, think about it. Now,
I have a great deal. I thought about it while I was there.
As we repeal our obligations to South Vietnam, we would presumably do the same thing to Thailand?
Thailand, now, here we do get into a different situation. I say, I think that the judgment of our foreign policy must be based on criteria which we have not yet applied to foreign policy. And I think that that means that in the case of a Vietnam, let us say, Charles Collingwood put it in very fine words, I think. He said that if we had read one book about the history of Vietnam, we wouldn't need 40 books to explain why we got in.
Oh, yeah, he's been touting that book for 5 years.
Well, the point is, let's think about not the touting, but what he said.
Yeah.
And what he said was that we should have considered the history of Vietnam. Now, I don't think that it's necessary for you and I to subject an audience to another session of the history of how we got involved.
I shocked him to death by telling him Walt Rostow had read the book.
Well,
he didn't know what to say.
the point is, I think, that Thailand represents a different situation vis-a-vis Laos and Cambodia. It's a strong government. It's a government which has been receiving aid from us, and although I'm against the idea of the United States necessarily affecting the outcome of governments all around the world, particularly Southeast Asia, the question of whether or not aid should be continued is a totally separate question from whether or not the United States should have a secret army of 10,000 Thais fighting in Laos, of whether or not we should have been bombing that country since 1965 without telling the Congress of the United States, separate from the CIA's activities in Laos.
You're talking about the conduct of the war. I really want to talk about treaties.
You cannot separate, you see, when policy, you're very, very familiar, I'm sure, with the terms, declaratory policy and action policy. And declaratory policy is that policy which a government espouses through its words. But once that government's policy, declaratory, changes and becomes action, you are in a different ballgame. And in Laos and Cambodia, it has become action. So I am talking about conduct because conduct is absolutely instrumental in any discussion of what is happening in the United States today. Of course it is, Mr. Buckley.
No, because...
But let me tell you why,
Mr.
perhaps.
Kerry, there hasn't been a war in which people do not use conduct that, under certain circumstances, you and I would join in deploring.
Absolutely.
But a treaty
That's not what I'm talking about.
Isn't a valid or an invalid treaty depending on whether you persuade the Thais, who after all are bound by the same treaty, to provide defense.
But you see, the difference is this, that we as a nation are supposedly responsible for our own morality and responsible for our own declarations and responsible for our own acts. I deplore...
But that's not
Now,
true.
let me finish, please.
We have a commander-in-chief. I'm not responsible for the morality of Mr. Nixon any more than I was of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he decided to zip 50 destroyers to England.
But you're bringing it down to an individual case. As a citizen of the United States, you are responsible. I have a right to vote
against him every 5 years.
You can do more than that, and you do more than that, Mr. Buckley. You ran for mayor, you sit on this program, you moralize, you write articles, you are affecting opinion.
But I can't pose as commander-in-chief.
But we're not asking you to do that, thank heavens.
No, but you are asking...
All we're trying to do for the moment, Mr. Buckley,
You're trying to say that there are all kinds of things happening in Southeast Asia that you don't approve, and I'm begging you to tell me.
I am going farther than pointing out all the kinds of things that are happening in Southeast Asia that I don't approve of. I also don't approve of the Viet Cong who cuts off a head. I don't approve of the North Vietnamese not announcing or adhering to the rules of the Geneva Conventions. I don't approve of that either. What I am saying is that I, as a citizen, have the capacity through my individuality, by reaching out to America as an individual and trying to speak to it, to say, look, here is where I think we ought to go. And if they follow or don't follow, But I'm saying
denied you that?
That's a question of responsibility.
Yeah, but I'm here to say to you, look, Mr. Kerry, sympathize though I might with your own abhorrence of certain things that are happening in Southeast Asia, I'm asking you, please, before I join your ranks, to explain to me what happens to the structure of treaties on the basis of which a certain equilibrium has been kept in the world if we've unilaterally collapsed one.
I'm doing that in one continual process, but at the same process, if you are going to join our ranks, which I sincerely hope you will consider, I have to try somehow to explain to you what those ranks are thinking and feeling and why. And what I am saying is that the conduct in Vietnam is responsible for a great many things, not the least of which is something that the book, The New Soldier, is all about, which is what has happened to men when they return to this country. What is happening in Vietnam right now? 1,500 men on the attack carrier Coral Sea are petitioning that that ship not go back to Vietnam. Men at Firebase Pace and all over Vietnam are refusing to carry out their orders. The discipline of our military...
I really don't understand your point.
My point is,
3,000 people were killed in New York City in 1863 because they resented the Civil War.
But you have to listen to understand my point. You have to let me finish it.
Go ahead.
My point is this, that the military now, Admiral Zumwalt, if he had 45% re-enlistments in the Navy, he thinks he could just make it. Right now, they are at 14%. The Air Force is at 13%. The Air Force at 16%. I'm coming to it. You haven't let me come to it.
Please.
The number of men who are re-enlisting in the Army, of those who are enlisting, 4% ask for combat and 2.5% ask for infantry. What has happened, Mr. Buckley, is that because of the conduct, because there is no great moral purpose, because there is nothing that men can adhere to, they are refusing to fight, and the discipline and ability of the military, and this is very important because you're talking about commitments in other countries. The ability of the United States to react to its commitments in other countries is now at the lowest state it has ever been because of Vietnam.
Mr. Kerry, if I may say so, that's historical balderdash.
It's not.
Because there has never been a correlation between the high moral purpose of a military enterprise and the enthusiasm with which it has been greeted in its country. The people rushed in the streets of Nazi Germany with enormous enthusiasm for the war, headed east and west. The Russians, with enormous enthusiasm, rallied to Stalin's banner to fight the Nazis and so on and so forth. There's no correlation at all.
Buckley,
it has to do with a whole series of variables.
They fought until they were beaten. And the United States, realistically, militarily, has not lost this war. Where it has lost this war is in its capacity to fight. And that is very real.
It has nothing to do with the morality of the war. It has to do with a whole series of other considerations, not the morality of the war.
To say that it has nothing to do with the morality of the war is, quite honestly, and I say this with all due respect, not to understand this war from the fighting man's point of view.
I don't doubt that individual people, even individual legions, have been persuaded by you and others of the, quote, immorality of the war. But this has to do with the nature of Americans' experiences with less than total effort. If it had been a total effort, my guess is that we would have won it, we would have been out of there, and would have been, in our recollection, something like the Dominican invasion of 1965. But the Americans have always had difficulty with ambiguity. We are an achievement-oriented society, and when we go in there to wipe the people up and win the goddamn war, this is what we expect to do. Now, to fight it as ambiguously as we did in my judgment, not the immorality of it, is what has caused people, the ambivalence, which is represented by our meeting here today. But what I do want to know from you is this. Granted, we've proved one thing, America has no staying power. We are not capable of a graduated response.
I disagree with you. I think if there were purpose, that my friends and I, who were the ones who were called on to fight this war, would stay wherever it were that we had to fight to defend something for the United States. I think America has very real staying power, and I think that's a degradation of the American fighting man and what we stand for.
I don't think so. It's part of the national temperament.
No, I disagree.
When we build the Empire State Building, we want to get the damn thing built, and up it goes, and we're through with it.
But we're not building an Empire State Building.
And we simply don't have the Oriental
psychology
psychology of 15 or 20, 25 years. But this is a clinical thing. England during the 19th century gave us the most peaceful century in the history of the world. There was never a year in which there wasn't military conflict during the 19th century, but the general understanding was that there would be continual conflict on a very small scale in order to preserve the larger pacification. In point of fact, fewer people have been killed since the Second World War during the age of nuclear politics than during any time of this century. Now, this is a very important datum for people who want to handle the problems of the world responsibly, rather than talk about thatched huts diplomacy.
But don't you see, Mr. Buckley, that they're closely intertwined? I want, but listen to me, I want very much to handle the problems of the world responsibly. I want very much to create a world order in which we can somehow
But you think Lyndon Johnson doesn't want to?
No, I don't think he didn't want to. I don't think Richard Nixon doesn't want to, frankly. I don't subscribe to the theory that so many of my contemporaries do, that he is necessarily an evil man.
You just say that your moral vision is more acute.
I think he is highly misguided. I think that he, and as the Pentagon Papers disclosed...
You're retreating from morality now, are you?
No, I'm not retreating at all from morality. I think they are closely intertwined, Mr. Buckley, closely intertwined. I've said it at least 5 or 6 times. I think he basically is
we're talking about Johnson
moral.
or Nixon now?
Well, I thought we were talking about Nixon.
By the way, suit yourself.
I will try. I think that Mr. Nixon is probably moral in so much as he is adhering to principles which he feels are moral and which are, in a sense, very much imbued in the American spirit. I think when you consider what has happened, the results of that, in terms of what is happening in Vietnam, what has happened throughout the world, the condemnation of our allies for our effort, their unwillingness to get into it if in fact a real threat was involved, and so on down the line, then you have to question whether or not they have, by accident, become immoral. And I think that's a very important point to consider, which is what I'm tying the whole thing into. Not in ignorance, but through pride and through adherence to something which I think is quite clearly outdated, and that is the application of this whole thing you brought up in the very beginning of this show, the question of commitments and threats. And I think that we have seen Vietnam as a threat. We have reacted to it much as we did when we created NATO to prevent Russia from sweeping into Europe, when we created CETO as an extension of what NATO was in John Foster Dulles' theory of containment. We created that. We have, in fact, seen our troops now committed to over 100 nations in the world. We have troops in over 42 of them. We give aid to over 40 of them. We've extended this great theory that we're going to affect this change throughout the world. And I think we carried it too far. I think in Vietnam, without really looking at the history of the country, without considering what was at stake for the United States, without considering the lessons of Korea and the whole thing that MacArthur was fired for when they debated whether they crossed the 17th parallel, and do commit the very forces which you talk about,
but you're
which
back
are
talking
total
about
commitment.
Tactics here.
It's not tactics, that's theory, Mr.
All right,
Buckley,
let me
theory.
ask you this question. Suppose you got an Italian politician, and that Italian politician is living in a world in which it is by no means predictable that by parliamentary process, his country won't go over to the side of the enemy, if you will permit me the term. Now, let us say that he is asked whether he believes in the constancy of the American commitment. It was a very firm commitment done with constitutional punctilio.
What does he do?
By everybody.
That's what you're going to ask. What does he do?
Now, is he or is he not influenced by the record of America's handling of other...
Of course he is.
Okay.
Of course he is, Mr. Buckley.
Okay.
But by the same token, you see, having done that to these people in Vietnam, do we consider to carry out that policy when the nation has, in a sense, let's put it in your words, not mine.
Okay.
You say lost its staying power, all right. Let's say it simply lost its staying power. Do you still continue to apply what is now then a mistake?
No, very, very good point.
To that
very good point.
application.
If you
and
say,
I don't think you do.
Sorry, gang, we tried.
Not just sorry, gang, you tried.
We tried. No, it was too much. The American people have lost enough lives, I say this quite sincerely, spent enough money, and we would rather gamble on the alternative than see it through. I understand this.
But something more is at stake, you see, because we are not just dealing in America. We are, when we are doing that, dealing in Vietnam, Vietnamese people, whom we had a capacity to think of as dinks and slopeheads and so on.
Speak for yourself.
We are more than that. Well, I'm speaking for the men who fought there then, Mr. Buckley.
And I know people who fought there who didn't think of them as dinks. Or
no, I also do. That's right. Perhaps that is a malapropism. I should say then for a considerable number, a great number. And for the training which helped them think that way, and for the country that we have, which still. But let me. If
there are racists in New York and racists in Mississippi, I don't see why there shouldn't be racists in Vietnam. But go ahead.
Well, I see why they shouldn't be, but perhaps they are.
You see why they shouldn't be?
I can see why they shouldn't
be. Period. But I don't see why people on arriving in Vietnam should be baptized free of all residual feelings about race.
No, Mr. Buckley, that's part and parcel of the whole problem, which is exactly what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
That intertwined with all the other problems is one of the reasons why, when you have lost your staying power, you cannot continue to perpetuate those things. What I believe in, I think the basic, that racism and the destruction and the feeling that, and let me couple it with the feeling that there is a commitment. All of them are closely intertwined. A commitment is based on the presumption that something very real is being stood up for, isn't it? Am I wrong? In other words, you make a commitment...
You can be. It depends on what you mean by very real. It can be very abstract, love.
Well, as far as
chivalry,
I'm concerned,
honor.
when it comes to killing men, when you decide that you are going to send your sons and other people to pull triggers and kill people, there is only one reason for which that should happen. And that is a most real threat to the ability of your nation and your way of life and your beliefs to survive.
I agree.
And if that were a threat,
Yeah.
I would go, Mr.
I agree.
Buckley, at the first moment.
Sure, I agree.
But that is not the reality in Vietnam.
Well,
and
that's your
most of this
opinion.
country, well, I would be glad to debate it with you. I would
Yeah,
be
but-
very happy
yeah, but
to,
I-
and
see,
I've tried to,
I've
as a matter of fact, but you've kept wanting to come back
No,
to the
because
other
I've
aspect.
debated it so often that I don't want to bore this audience. I want to talk about...
Well, I don't know.
Not
Are they
about,
bored? Are you bored?
Well, I don't mean this audience. I mean the other 2 million.
You're insignificant.
No,
I'm
you're not
sorry.
insignificant at all. But, you know, perhaps they have the same curiosity to find out what I have a curiosity to find out, which is, namely, what are the consequences? To me, it's perfectly easy to say we should pull out of Vietnam and the immediate consequences are that 25 people won't get killed next week, and which is a very, very, very serious achievement. But if, in fact, it's going to cause a collapse of a series of alliances in other parts of the world, the end of the NATO deterrent, then I can see a situation where we save 25 people next week in order to kill 25 million next year.
Let's take that to its logical conclusion, then. I'm very happy to.
All right. So let's go back to the Italian, who looks at America's record as regards treaties.
Well, before, we didn't get there. I mean, that's not where it was going. It was going to the question of these other commitments. The ability of NATO to survive and everything is where you wound that thought up. And I'd like to pick it up there, and that is to say that, let us assume that we continue in Vietnam as we are. Which nation in the world? I mean, I think you or somebody is assuming that these other nations in the world are stupid, that they don't have the capacity to understand the limitations that have been posed on us because of what we have accomplished or have not accomplished in Vietnam. They are very, very aware of our failures there. And by staying there, we are not going to fake them into thinking that our credibility in some other part of the world is more real. We just can't pretend that way.
Well, I don't know why, I don't know why you speak with such certitude about your own reading of the public psychology. It seems to me that there must be, because I know of some and you know of some, people who are looking at America and seeing what America's record is. Now, a lot of them have been very impressed by the sacrifices we've made in South Vietnam, and a lot of them undoubtedly feel that it's been such a strain on America that isolationist sentiment has asserted itself, which actually endangers
But you see,
all
this leads up
treaties.
to the whole question of the future, Mr. Buckley, and to the ability, I think, of nations in the world to survive. And that is to say that if these countries who do see some great positive thing in what we've done in Vietnam, if those countries are going to believe that we're going to protect them in the future, willy-nilly, and that they can survive because of our commitment in Vietnam and our lasting power, or whatever you want to call it, then I think they're sorely mistaken, because I think that what Vietnam has demonstrated is that our entire foreign policy must take a new turn. That we've got to find a new realism.
Fair enough.
And that those countries
that's right.
are going to have to be subjected to a reappraisal of our ability to stand for them, or not necessarily just to stand for them, but how we will do it. I think that the United States has the capacity to stand for a great many countries in the world, but not necessarily and here we come to conduct, which I know you don't like to talk about, but not necessarily by waging secretive wars in their countries, not necessarily by having the CIA involved in the overthrow of a government in their country, but by standing up for the kind of country we say we want them to be, by being that country ourselves here at home, at the same time as we sort of maintain a arm's length in terms of the factional shifts of power that are going to occur in those countries.
No, I have no interest in other people's internal politics. As a student of history and political science, I do, but
you see, the government...
I'm not in favor of it. But or let's be concrete.
But the government of the United States has had great interest because we were integrally a part of the Diem overthrow. We have been integrally part of the Lon Nol and Sihanouk. We have been integrally part of what has taken place in Laos. And I think we have espoused a great...
When we are at war, we tend to exert ourselves, that's true.
But we weren't at war with Laos and
I think
Cambodia,
the Diem,
that's the point.
I think, well, no, we know.
When President Nixon assumed office in 1968, there was no real war in Cambodia. There was a secretive war in Laos.
Mr. Kerry, the Cambodian territory has been used in contravention of international practice by the enemy to kill American soldiers since 1965. Our rights to intervene in the situation in Cambodia.
What were the American soldiers doing there that they should be killed in the first place?
We were there pursuing the provisions of the Sito Treaty.
The provisions of what? Well, now we get into this whole thing of the Sito Treaty,
ratified the 1st of February of 1955 by the Senate, with every Democratic member there.
Why aren't all the Sito countries there with us?
Well, in part because some of them are broke, in part because some of them are demoralized.
Well, we've been very good at paying for things when other people are broke. In fact, we tried to pay for them and they didn't want to come.
If you want to switch your tactics to reproach the extent to which other people have not lived up to their obligations, I'll join with you. And having done with that...
No, mine goes beyond reproach, Mr. Buckley. I don't think we have any business being there.
To your extraordinary finding that we had no rights to keep people from using ostensibly neutral territory in order to form sanctuaries with which to kill American soldiers and South Vietnam soldiers.
Mr. Buckley, if you happen to believe, as I do, that those American soldiers have no business in the first place being there, then you cannot condone the intercession of American troops to prevent sanctuary from being used. You just can't do that, and I happen to believe that. I don't think America has any business in South Vietnam. Now, I'd like you to tell me why we do. We've been talking about
what you think of it is a very little immediate bearing to the situation of South Vietnamese who are being killed. You may remember that this thing was adjudicated in the case of Greece after the First World War, when the English occupied the port of Salonika, and the Greece was a neutral power.
What was adjudicated?
What was adjudicated was a suit by Greece against Germany, because Germany bombed.
So now we're getting into international law.
If you don't mind my explaining it to you.
No, but I mean, why don't we apply the international law of Nuremberg to Vietnam then?
Well, because the best minds have not seen the analogies which you find pressing. But let me finish.
Telford Taylor is not among the best minds.
No, not in this instance.
Not really.
No.
All right.
But let me, well, presumably if he were, he would win a little bit more of sympathy by his colleagues. But just to finish this, because I'm sure you're not uninterested in international law.
No, I'm not.
What happened, of course, was that the Greeks sued the Germans because the Germans bombed Salonika in order to pulverize the English. And a tribunal ruled that because Greece had not successfully ejected the English, therefore it was the right of a combatant power, which was being itself fought in its belligerent capacity by the British, that they had a right to take what measures they could. That situation exactly matches the Cambodian situation. But to get back to what
international law, you see, the great fallacy of that, Mr. Buckley, is that international law has never been applied to Vietnam. And if, in fact, it had been applied to Vietnam, then we would have to seriously question what the conduct of our troops has been.
I don't know what you mean by, quote, applied, because international law is not is very seldom something which you, quote, apply.
International
but
law,
if you assume a situation,
but no body has been called upon to try and rule whether or not the United States or any other. There has been no international body brought into
because it doesn't usually
Vietnam
happen
conflict.
Pending situations. If you know the process of international, what happens is after. If Cambodia,
it happens after only when victors decide that the vanquished will in fact be brought to task.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Isn't that the history of Nuremberg, really, and Yamashita?
It's an unfortunate thing for you to bring up right now, because I just gave you a historical parallel in which Germany, a defeated power, won in its suit against England, which was a winning power. I'm saying that if Cambodia were to bring suit next year in the World Court or wherever, under the rules of the Hague Convention, and ask America or South Vietnam for retributions as a result of the bombing we did in Cambodia, according to the known precedent, they would not succeed.
Well, I will agree with you that the question of the law is very, very difficult, and that it hasn't come before a body, and I think it should. But I will say that I think that still the question of the sanctuary thing, if you're going to apply international law to allowing troops to violate sanctuary, then you must at the same time, if you are applying it ad hoc to Vietnam, allow me to apply it in so much as I am objecting to the very presence of those troops. And I think that is a question of consistency. You are and I am both applying it. But let's come back to
you haven't come up with a de facto government of South Vietnam that has asked our troops to go home. And you certainly haven't come up with an absence of constitutional
because we came up with a de facto government which asked them to be there.
You say we came up. There's no reason to suppose that we came up with that government.
Well, Mr. Buckley, I think
even DM
I think it'd be a terrible injustice not to get to the question which ultimately comes down, the one that you raised, which I think is very, very pertinent. And I think we can talk for hours about why we're there and what happened. But the question is now, should we get out, and what is really at stake?
No, that's not the question.
The question is, what is at stake?
The question is what is at stake, exactly.
Exactly. And what is at stake is intimately tied to if nothing is at stake, you get out. And I have said that nothing is at stake, and I think it still behooves upon you to tell me what is really at stake in terms of proving to these nations who don't believe in the United States anyway, who abhor what we are doing in Vietnam, who have called on us to get out, why our credibility is so at stake in their eyes.
Suppose I cite the foreign minister of Israel on this program 1 year ago.
But Israel, we are still selling weapons to Israel.
No, I consider him an important human being.
Yes.
And I'm giving you his opinion because
more
perhaps it's more
than somebody
than
who's being killed in Vietnam.
As regards what we're talking about, much more, sure. Because he's the foreign minister of a country. And what he said was that if we pulled out of Vietnam precipitately, it would prove to him and to the people of Israel that our treaty commitments are less than reliable.
Do you really believe...
He didn't then outline what he would do. There
are
a hell of a lot of choices.
But do you really
But you say, what does it mean? There's an example of something it means.
Do you really believe that America has the... I just don't believe this, judging from the politics that are involved in it, and your being from New York and my being very aware of New York politics alone. I simply don't believe that there is in this country the capacity to very readily leave the commitment that has been made in Israel. I think that's been proven, and I think most Americans...
You're saying because there's a Jewish vote in England, Israel uniquely doesn't have to worry about anything?
In England.
In New York?
In New York.
That Israel uniquely is protected?
Not uniquely, but I think it's gone a long way towards affecting how Senator Javits and many other senators feel. You better believe it.
Well, therefore, our commitments to Australia, however...
No, I think on the contrary. Now, there we come back
because we don't have an Australian lobby?
No. There we come back to the original question which you raised, which I'm totally in agreement with you with, I think. And that is that there are nations in the world who are, and I said this in the very beginning of the show, because of both ethnic, political, religious, and many other things, economic, so on, closely tied to the United States through their systems and other things, whereby there are very real threats. And I can see Australia, where you have a government, which is a democratic government, where you have a people who are closely tied to America. If suddenly there was something to occur there, which was not the result, let us say, of popular demand, which was not the result of the people in that country themselves deciding this is where they wanted to go, that could represent a great loss to the United States and to the balance of power. And that would be very, very real. But what I have continually said in this show, and I think that applies to Israel, I think that applies to Western Europe, I think that applies to other countries in the world, to Canada, to possibly Mexico, certainly Latin America is a different situation altogether. But I think that these are real threats. And what I continually say, Mr. Buckley, is that Vietnam is not a threat, and that you cannot justify the loss of American life or Vietnamese life by continuing this war one more day. And I think that it is closely tied to what is happening in this country, because we are a country of promises, a country of rhetoric in a sense. And that country which makes those promises and allows a president who ran in 1968 to say, I have a secret plan for peace, and 3.5 years later the greatest promise kept is that the plan is still a secret, I think that that is really wrong, and that goes to undermine the whole roots of what we believe in our government and our ability to react to people in this country.
Well, Mr. Nixon never, of course, promised to end the war.
He promised that he had a plan for peace, Mr. Buckley.
In the sense that the Democrats promised not to enter war.
But let me ask you this.
He simply promised to wind it down.
I'm not trying to protect President Johnson or a Democrat or anything else.
No, you're not. But it seems to me that it takes a special amount of sanctimony to be able to say that there is no justification because you can't find justification.
No,
Why
no.
don't you say, I see no justification, and concede that there are other people with equal moral precision?
I have not
who do see
denied that there are
justification.
not
You said
other
there is
people,
no
Mr. Buckley. You're sitting here.
You said there is no
see-
justification. You said
you
should
see
say,
justification.
I see no justification.
You have not yet described it to me in the course of our debate, but you see justification.
Read my collected
Now,
works.
I've read them. I really have. But my point is that those people clearly, according to most polls in this country, according to world opinion, are not now in the majority. And clearly, President Nixon, when he ran, said, I have a plan for peace. Did he not say
world
that?
opinion is mostly uninteresting.
But did Mr. Nixon not say that?
Of course he did. He has a plan
All right.
for peace.
Now, if he, when he had that plan for peace, had said to Americans, my plan for peace means 19,762 Americans and countless Vietnamese and the largest tonnage of bomb in the history of mankind.
He would have been a
and dropped
charlatan.
it, would
if
he have
said
won?
that. No, he would have been a charlatan if he said that, because
Would he have won?
it's impossible to... that's a silly question. It really is a silly
It's
question.
not a silly
because
question.
the answer is no president will ever win any election if he tells the people what they're going to suffer during the ensuing 4 years. Do you think Mr. Lindsay would be elected mayor of New York if he said there are going to be more people murdered per month in New York City than there are in Vietnam, which is true, by the way?
But exactly.
Do you think he'd be
the
elected?
whole point
No, of course
is
not.
that Mr.
You just
Lindsay,
don't stress these things.
Mr. Lindsay has obviously limited control over that, and in so much as he does have control, he is genuinely, I think, trying to effect some change there. I do not believe that President Nixon is genuinely trying to, except in so much...
There's a sense in which the president has limited control, too.
No, the president, Mr. Buckley, has total control in his capacity to end the war in Vietnam. And to not say that he doesn't is to deny his
all you
own
have
power.
to do is read the writings of Mr. Kennedy, of Mr. Eisenhower, of Mr. Johnson, and of Mr. Nixon, who say that they do not feel that they have total control. There's a sense in which there's integrity in the process that dates back over a series when people were making arduous efforts to build up the peace.
I suppose that
For him to
Congress...
simply collapse it is to be anarchistic.
I suppose the Congress of the United States and the people of the United States are the ones who are trying to continue this war, then.
Well, I don't see that Congress has stopped the funding of the war.
No,
if
for
Congress
very real
stopped
reasons.
the war tomorrow by simply stopping the
For very
funding.
real reasons, and it comes back to the president's power. They have not stopped it because the
That's a circular
president has
argument.
it is a circular argument which makes, thank God, a full circle, which comes back to the power of the presidency, which says that he has the power to end the war tomorrow if he were simply to accept the terms of a peace treaty, if he were to say, I am setting a date for total withdrawal.
That's like saying that you have the power to assassinate the president. Sure, you have the power mechanically understood.
You're telling me
you
that
don't
the
have
president...
the power spiritually or constitutionally
Let's make this
understood.
very clear. What you are telling me is that the president cannot go on TV and say all troops will be withdrawn from Vietnam by such and such a date. Does he have that power?
Not without taking into account a whole series of considerations of which he was not the author.
Such as?
Such as, we will turn to Mr. Feingold.
Well, you know, just from listening to what I've heard here about the relationship between morality and commitment, I think there was a certain morality which committed us to Vietnam, and I think there is a different morality now, and it might be reflected in our commitment towards Israel. And I was wondering, the third world countries are very interested in seeing how we commit ourselves, and I think now that our morality is up in the air like it is right now, how will we commit ourselves to the third world nations?
I don't know. I don't know. And that's the great dilemma, I think, is that it depends a lot on the leadership of the country and whether or not we continue the present policy that we have now. If we do, then I think the reaction of the third world will be similar to what it was in the United Nations on the vote on China, when they, in a sense, took pleasure out of slapping America in the face. And I think that what we have to do is reappraise how we are going to approach these people at the same time. And I'm not saying that, and I don't mean to give this impression, I don't want to Mr. Buckley or anybody else, that I think that America is all bad or all wrong or anything else. I'm simply saying that the moralism, which I think is one of very high purpose, has been misdirected. And that I think if we can direct that moralism the right way towards those countries, with an awareness of the nationalistic aspirations of the people within those countries, with an awareness of where they want to take their country, not where we want them to take it. If we can approach them with a certain sense of altruism which is sensitive to them as a people and to their history, then perhaps we will be better off. I think that our reaction, and this is what I've been trying to talk about with Mr. Buckley, that our reaction to this thing, communism throughout the world, is a very dangerous one, and I think that the failures of communism to really be that all-encompassing historical movement that it says it is, the failures of China, which is a very poor country, the failures of Russia, in so much as in its own years since Stalin died, in those 20 years it has suffered a certain disintegration of its own empire, that its failures prove to a certain degree to be that communism is not such a real threat, and that we must therefore start to react more to the desires of those nations and not so much to that thing we call that threat of communism.
Well, communism did a pretty good job of encompassing Czechoslovakia, but
well,
go
Mr.
ahead,
Buckley, it did, but our ability to react to it and our ability to react to Pakistan or Biafra or anything else was certainly tied by what has happened in Vietnam.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying that that's right. I've said that consistently.
It's tied to an ambiguity of policies that I've
certainly
been remarking on for 20 years. Ms. Bloom.
Yes, I'd like to find out, since you have such an intimate knowledge of what's going on with the fighting men over in Vietnam, what kind of grassroots movements are there to end the war from those people?
You know, I wish we'd had more chance to talk about that today, but what is happening to the troops is a very real thing, and I'd like to just digress a moment from your question, because the situation in the veterans' hospitals in this country is deplorable, and not because the doctors aren't good, not because they don't want to do something, but because the money simply doesn't exist, because the post-operative care isn't there. The drug problem, there are estimates from the Drug Services Agency here in New York that there are about 15,000 to 20,000 Vietnam veteran addicts on the streets of New York. There's 6,000 to 10,000 in Boston, where I come from. It's just an incredible problem which hasn't been broached, and all of this is
I think you're absolutely
very
right,
much
by the way.
part of what is sweeping Vietnam now. The reason men take drugs is because they cannot, as they phrase it, as everybody has phrased it, how can a man be the last guy to die for what they consider as a mistake?
The reason they take drugs is because drugs are fun.
No, Mr. Buckley.
Yes, they are. That's why most people take drugs.
I really want to take...
Why do most people take booze? Why do they take narcotics? Because
I really want to take issue with you on that. In Vietnam, it is not a question of its being fun. Now, I've lived this.
I'll bet you there are more people at Yale University taking grass than there are in Vietnam.
Grass is a totally different thing from heroin.
Escapism.
It's no worse than alcohol, and you had Dr. Grimspoon on last week who talked about it, and I think you agree probably. That's a question of marijuana. Marijuana is a very different thing from hard drugs and barbiturates and other things.
No, I know.
What I'm talking about is the guys who take it
I'm
because...
challenging the notion that there's a correlation between despair in Vietnam
I'd be willing to do this. I would be willing
to
do this. I invite you now, you and I, because I have been trying to do this and have met with some opposition to it because of my stand on the war. You and I will go back to Vietnam in January or next month, and we will talk to the troops there and come back and tell this country whether or not you see a correlation. Because I am telling you that the troops there do it because it is absurd, and there is the only way to get through it.
I'll be in Vietnam in January, and I'd be
I'd love to go with
come
you.
with me. But I would not. It's very seldom, as a matter of human experience, that you run into somebody who hasn't got an excuse for taking drugs.
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that
the best book I've ever read on is called Man-Child in the Promised Land. And he delves very much into the psychology of addicts, which tends to run towards self-pity.
You see, many people have certainly started it because it was fun. I don't deny that. I think one of the most bewildering reasons in Vietnam was. But to come back to your question on that, the movement in Vietnam is very real, as witnessed fire-based pace. And if you could read, we have about 3,000 active members in Vietnam now. We receive letters from them constantly. And they are trying to have peace rallies over there. They are trying to, search and destroy missions are now called search and avoid missions. They go out and they don't try and encounter the enemy. There are tacit agreements in some areas. They are literally trying not to fight the war. And I think that the true scope of this has not yet come out to the country, and it probably will at some point in the future. You may be familiar with the efforts of the sailors on the Constellation, the carrier, not to go back. And now it's on the Coral Sea, and I think it is quite predominant.
I think you're struggling to make the point that wars are unpleasant, but...
No, I'm going beyond the question of wars being unpleasant, Mr. Buckley. I've tried to say all night that if the war had a purpose, I would fight. Despite the unpleasantness, despite the sheer horror.
I have the highest respect for the arguments of the pacifist. I find them intellectually very rigorous, and I have never thought of a war as trivial. And that's why I think in order to avoid wars, You've got to make very important sacrifices. And I understand us there to be doing what the English tried to do with their fleet in the 19th century.
I understand that you think that, but
yeah.
I think we are not, which is the
Mr.
difference.
Let's give Mr. Ferry a crack here. And then,
The only thing I, would address myself to is that I think the issue of moralism is a misplaced argument, because I think that it's a rationalization that's historically been used by power groups to sort of dissuade the direct criticism. And I think that the address should be to the interpersonal aspects, which is what Leslie started talking about. And that is that, contrary to the use of drugs, as you laid its purpose to, being sort of entertainment, I think it's the only act of revolution that a person can use in so restrictive a system as the Army.
well, there's suicide, too.
Well, it's an act of revolution. I'll take that point of view.
Yeah,
and I would just like to know...
Suicide was urged as the only serious philosophical protest before the Vietnam War by Albert Camus.
Well, I don't want to get in a sophist discussion, but I'd just like to ask what kind of support is being offered inside the Army for that kind of revolutionary action, a very interpersonal attack on the war.
From the Army itself?
No, within the, what kind of organizations are functioning within
There
the
is
GI?
an organization called the Concerned Officers Movement, which is active duty officers ranging from the enlisted men, actually, all the way up through colonels. And they are working very hard to try and contest the war. And beyond that, there are just the normal channels of underground and the coffee houses and everything else that has existed. It's a very, very difficult fight. It's part and parcel of the whole problem of why My Lais aren't talked about, why they are covered up, why misleading reports come through from the field, why body counts are inflated, of all of those things, why they happen. Which
is this sort of a frontline attempt to bring those issues sort of to the public view within the Army by those officers in their sort of ranked position?
It very much is, yes.
It is?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Feingold?
Well, I was just wondering if these soldiers in Vietnam, they represent, some kind of an historical. There are historical soldiers in the sense that they're fighting for a piece of history. But I wonder if they really represent the people back in this country, who back up this historical thing. In other words, if you tear off the surface of the soldiers themselves, to try to understand the ideals or the ideas behind the war and the ideas that are behind the war right now, I wonder if they're really representing them, really representing us in a historical sense.
That's a very difficult question, and I don't kind of have the answer. I'm not sure if they are representing whatever us is in the historical sense.
Well, if you'd like to address yourself to that.
They are representing something very, very unique, because I suppose they are really the first time in the history of this country, at least, that during a war, soldiers have taken the kinds of stands that they are taking. And
No, they did in the Civil War.
Yes, they did. They did in the Civil War, and there were tremendous draft uprisings and everything else then. But I think certainly in recent history and in the context of this war, it's a very, very important step. What continually gets to me, and I don't always want to come back to moralism, because I don't particularly like it as an argument.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kerry, I have to interrupt you, but thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
For a printed copy of this program, send 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. That address again, Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.